Hi, I'm Will, and this is the Webb Dean Stevens Museum in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Today, I'd like to talk to you about personal communication. Nowadays, personal communication can take many forms, including text messages, emails, and the written letter. In the 18th century, however, the written letter was really your only option. Much like today, in order to write a letter, you needed two things: a piece of paper and something to write with. However, nowadays we use ballpoint pens, much like this. In the 18th century, they used something a little bit different. They would have used a feather pen or quill pen, and so you take this, and then you have a little jar of liquid ink, so you dip the tip of the pen into the ink and use that to write out your letter. Once you were done writing your letter, then you had a piece of paper that was covered in wet ink. So how do you get the ink to dry? Well, there were a few options available, one of which was sand. So you would take a device known as a sander. Essentially, it works like a salt shaker. And so you take this and sprinkle some of the sand onto the paper and let the sand help to soak up the extra ink. Once the ink had dried, you pick up your piece of paper, you would blow on it to get the sand off, and then you're ready for the next step. The next step was to fold the letter, much like it is today. However, nowadays, once we folded the letter once, we usually tuck it into an envelope and send it on its way. In the 18th century, they didn't have envelopes, and so the folding process was a little bit different. You take your letter and you start by folding it top and bottom like we do today. However, then you turn your letter and you fold it top and bottom again. And at this point, you can write the address of the recipient on the back side. The question next becomes, how do we keep the letter closed? You can't lick the envelope and seal it shut like we do today. Instead, you had to use wax. So you would use a special wax called sealing wax. This particular example has a wick in it already, so it's sort of a candle. So you would light the wick and let the wax melt, and you would drip some of that wet wax onto the seam between the two edges of the paper here. While the wax is still warm and soft, you would take a stamp and you would press that into the wax, and this would keep the letter shut, but it would also add a certain layer of security in that the stamp used oftentimes had a mark unique to the individual, sort of your personal seal. And so this was another way to reassure the recipient of the letter that you were indeed the person who sent the letter and no one's trying to commit some sort of identity fraud. We have here an example of a letter written by Samuel Blatchley Webb in 1801. And so he writes his letter out on one side, and if we flip the paper over, we can see how it had been folded originally, much like our letter here, and it had been addressed to its recipient and sealed with a wax seal. This has just been a very brief look at letter writing in the 18th century. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again in another video. Take care.